Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mobile Woodshed, episode number 3. Today, we're going to talk about the late, great Elizabeth Cotten. I first heard about Elizabeth via a box set I had when I was younger, and it was a diverse mix of various artists. And she was at the end of one of the discs, and it was her iconic song Freight Train, which she had written in her teens, I believe. But that melody and her haunting voice, it stayed with me for years. And when I moved to Cincinnati around 2010, I'd go to the public library downtown, and they have this amazing music collection and CD collection. And I stumbled upon this, which I don't have the physical release of. I had to return it. But this album here, which has been released under several names. This one's Folk Songs and Instrumentals. I think it's also been known as Freight Train and other North Carolina folk songs. But it displays, her great talent. And the making of this is really interesting, which I'll get to. But this style, there's a big contrast between this blues style of the eastern United States in contrast to, say, the Delta blues of Son House and Robert Johnson, which is a more visceral, grittier thing entirely. This music, I would say, lends itself to more, major chords and melody, and it's been called Piedmont blues and string music, and it has roots to African melodies, and that's cross-pollinated with Appalachian music. And so you think about people like Mississippi John Hurt, Etta Baker, another great female blues guitar player. So it's just a different feel entirely. Taj Mahal has been a big ambassador of that style as well. So Elizabeth, she was born in 1893 in what was called Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I believe that's called Carrboro now. And she was born into a musical family, and she first played banjo, which, a banjo has a high string that ends at the fifth fret up on top, which maybe foreshadows where she would take the guitar later. We'll get to that. She didn't have a name as a little girl. Her parents didn't name her. They'd call her Lil Sis. And not until she was in class one day and the teacher asked her name, she just named herself right then and there, Elizabeth, which I find fascinating. So, at age 9, she was a domestic worker, and she was earning $1 a day. And she would give those dollars to her mom, who would eventually buy her a Sears and Roebuck guitar. I believe it was a Stella. And Elizabeth was left-handed, southpaw, as they say. The guitar was made for a right-handed player, so she did the thing where she played it like this. I guess this is a mirror image of what hers would look like, but with the high E at the bottom here and the low E down here. So she was playing, she developed a style where she was playing bass lines with her forefinger and then melodies with her thumb, and that would become known as Cotten Picking. And so, there's some other guitar players down through blues history and music history in general that played this way. Albert King comes to mind, Otis Rush. In the surf world, there's Dick Dale. But it provided her and others for unique and esoteric voicings that you wouldn't find, I guess, right side up. So, anyway, so she developed a style, and she was playing, throughout her teenage years, and she wrote Freight Train, I think, for a family gathering, and that tune became legendary. It's like an American traditional song. And of course, it was inspired by the nearby trains that ran, and she'd play around the train tracks with her brothers, and Anyway, she married at 17 to a guy named Frank, and they had a daughter. And between her work and well, the church didn't really condone her playing of secular music. All these things were a recipe for her to stop playing, and she didn't play guitar for something like 50 years, which leads me to one of the craziest, uncanny, unlikely rediscovery stories I've ever heard, which cross-references back to our last episode with Robert Ward, was a rediscovery story. But she moved to Washington D.C. after a divorce, and she was living with her daughter, and she was working at a department store called Landsberg's selling dolls. And one day there was a missing child, a little girl, and she returned this little girl. She found the parents. Well, this family turned out to be the Seegers, which I'm sure you've heard of Pete Seeger, Mike Seeger. These are some of the most renowned musicologists and musicians of the 20th century. And Ruth just took a liking to Elizabeth and the way she cared for finding her daughter and returning her. And they ended up hiring her as a maid. And, they didn't even know of her musical talent until one day one of the little girls walked by Elizabeth's room and heard her playing a guitar that was around and was, shocked. And so Mike would go to her home and ended up recording her with a reel-to-reel, and those recordings became this album. And this stuff became incalculably influential in different ways. It got into the Greenwich Village scene and influenced people like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, etc. It also reached England in sort of a weird way, in that some people had a hit with Freight Train. The names were, I think, Chaz McDewitt and Nancy Whiskey, but the copyright was not correct, and later the Seeger family fixed all that for Elizabeth, which is beautiful. But that British version reached people like the Quarrymen, an early incarnation of the Beatles. So her music was already rippling out and branching out and influencing people worldwide not long after she was rediscovered. And she quickly, started, doing big prestigious shows, the Newport Folk Festival, and toured with Taj Mahal. And her legend grew. She made more albums, one called Shake Sugaree. And on Shake Sugaree, her great-granddaughter sings. And that great-granddaughter would wind up in the Undisputed Truth. And once again, a cross-reference to our last episode, Robert Ward played for a spell in that band. So it's fun doing these episodes and finding these connections and correlations and finding how small of a world it is. But her legend would grow, and in her later years, she'd get a National Endowment of the Arts, and she actually won a Grammy in 1984 for her live album, Elizabeth Cotten Live, which is an amazing record and has some great rapport. She's really funny, and it's beautiful stuff. So do check these records out if you get a chance. She got older, and or her last place of residency was in Syracuse, New York, and she lived till 94. And there is a statue there of her, a bronze statue that says Libba on it, which is the name the Seeger kids gave her, and she embraced later in life. And so if you're in Syracuse, go check that out. But I'm going to put some links to her albums and some great articles on her and some live footage. There's thankfully a lot of film of her playing, and you can get a look at how she played. I'm obviously strung normally here, so I will show my interpretation of her approach. but do check her out. You know, she's one of those players that you can't really copy. There's just so much idiosyncratic, esoteric stuff going on. But without further ado, we'll get into some guitar playing here. So thank you so much for joining me. All right, let's get into Elizabeth's most well-known tune, Freight Train. I am tuned a whole step down in the name of tuning to how she was tuned on that famous recording. Apologies out there. But I'm playing as if I'm in C. So she uses the chord shapes of C, F, G, various forms of that G that we'll get into, and she'll throw in an E7 from time to time, almost like a B section or a bridge. And so yeah, she would use her thumb and her first finger and second finger. Of course, she's reversed, so she's playing using different fingers to do the bass line and the melody. But that's still how even right side up players would play, were those fingers from that area, Appalachian music. I will resort sometimes to using my third finger as well. You know, at the end of the day, it's really whatever works best for you. But a big part of this style is holding down a bass line, which in blues they'll call dead thumbing. John Hurt was a master of that. And so, like on Freight Train here, and then on the 5, G, 6 string, 4 string, and then the melody is played on top of that, which, you know, when I first heard this stuff, it's like, wow, how do you do that? It's like you have to have two brains. I guess it's akin to playing piano. And it took me a lot of time to get some kind of handle on it. And I would break it down with, well, what melody note, top note, is falling on a particular bass note? And that's sort of how I had to dissect it. And then in time, just playing for hours, finally starting to being able to throw away thinking about it. So that's, I mean, it really just takes time. But here's Freight Train, and you'll get the idea of the bass line and the melody on top. Here we go. So yeah, there's a lot going on there, and I just want to get into a few of the idiosyncratic things that happen. One is on that main melody. I used to play it real squared off. And going back and listening on that descent off the G chord, she does this cool staggered, sort of delayed thing with that top melody, which is this. So, so it's just good to note those little nuances that are a little deeper than just playing it squared off, you know? And then there's these other little embellishments she'll throw in that are almost like cartilage in between the chord changes, like that one. What is that? G, B, D, and bouncing off that bass note. Now she'll go to this E7 section that is like, occasionally, more so live, when she goes to that F off the E7, you'll hear her bend this sixth note off of the B string, which upon deeper listening this last week, I noticed is emulating her climbing back up to the C, which on the original version, she throws that in, which would sound like, which is a nice touch. But more so in the later years, you hear her just bend that. And another thing that she does at the very end of the tune is this little bass line ending, which sounds like. And in later live recordings, you'll hear her throw that little bass line run at the end of phrases or at the end of choruses throughout the song. You know, she'll be like. It's kind of a neat thing. So I want to touch on some of these different chord voicings that are really cool to me, and I've heard them in Bob Dylan music. I think of like "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right," and they just have a cool color to them. They almost sound like an autumn sound to me. I don't know, they're just beautiful. And one of those would be the way she plays a G chord on this. Let's see. Now that one, that's a G7, but it's fairly open. You're just hitting the G here and the 7 on top, and then everything else is open. So that one's a little different. And then there's and when she returns to the C this time, it has a G on the bottom, which sounds like, which just has this beautiful bronze valor sound to me. I don't know, it's just really nice. And then I love this one on the very end of a chorus, which I guess is a G7 in essence, but you have a G, the 7 of it, and then an open G and B. I think maybe that's some kind of suspended chord, but it really leads into that C, you know, with that B, C. It just wraps itself up nicely there. So once again, so I hope that helps a little bit. We're gonna move on to another tune. All right, the next tune I want to talk about is Honey Babe, Your Papa Cares for You. She wrote this tune when she was visiting an uncle down in South Carolina, and she had heard somebody playing guitar and singing on the other side of some doorway, and he was singing that line and playing guitar, but she couldn't really make it out. She went to the guitar and she composed this based on what she can gather, what she could remember from what she had heard, which is an interesting way to compose. It reminds me of an interview I read with Tom Waits, where he said he's come up with rhythms and things from hearing bands from the other side of a wall and say a bar. So, you know, you're hearing things wrong perhaps, or inside out. Maybe the melody has a Doppler effect. It's an interesting way to compose. Anyway, so this thing, it's got a really cool intro, a really unique thing going on with primarily major, but she throws in these really dissonant things with like a flat third and going to a minor chord as well that keeps that flat third going on. So it's got a lot of tension and release, especially when she goes down to this, wraps things up with that D with the F sharp in the bass, back to G. I'll play a bit of it and we'll break it down. So. So that's the main sections of the song. Yeah, so you have that G chord, and then she'll throw in those flat thirds that really blues it up, and then, she'll go down and use those as well over the E minor section, which is really dissonant. And then that release going down to the, which is, a D7, I think, in essence. But you have F sharp in the bass. It's more of a suspended sounding chord to me. And on those E minor sections, hammering on from the D to the E. Never heard anybody do that. It's a cool effect. And then she'll throw in that flat third. Very dissonant. Once again, we're dead thumbing. This one is mostly just 6th string, 4th string, 6th string, 4th string. Pretty much throughout. Say it's worth checking out, her first recording of that, and then the later live versions and other versions you can find of her playing it. It seemed like she didn't play anything the same way twice, which is a beautiful thing. But even the structures of the songs, you have these main themes that she always hits, but they won't always be necessarily the same order or the same length, which, musically speaking, this stuff, it's like, it's kind of fluid and not in stone, and it's more about falling into a musical trance of sorts playing this stuff, and you might hang on a section for a little longer than usual. This stuff lends itself well to sitting with a guitar and playing all day and sort of working it into a lather, and it saturating, and it's still early, so I'm not quite there yet. So I hope this stuff is helpful. There's a few other tunes I wanted to touch on that I'm just not going to have time for just yet. Vestapol, Spanish Flang Dang. So we'll probably have to do another episode to hit those. So thank you so much for joining me. This music is wonderful, and I'm happy to share it with you. And if you haven't checked her out, I hope you go take a look at some of the links I've attached. And once again, I appreciate everybody's support out there, and I'm having a ball doing this series, and look forward to doing it more. So we'll see you down the road a piece. Thank you.